Hello, hello, hello. I'm Alan Walker, and welcome to episode 8 of the Talent Intelligence Collective podcast. I'm going to do the yay myself. Yay! We normally press a little button for that. So we've got a very special episode for you today. Not only are we recording it in video, and of course the usual audio, links to both will be in the description wherever you are seeing this, but we're flipping things a little. As a one-off, our co-hosts Toby Coulshaw and Nick Brooks will also be our guests. Many of you have said that you want to learn more about them, their work, their views on all things TI, and you can never accuse of us not listening to our audience. So this will be a little odd, but hopefully a lot of fun. So let's crack on. I'm delighted as ever to be joined by Alison Ettridge of Talent Intuition, Nick Brooks of Microsoft, and Toby Coulshaw of Amazon as my co-hosts. Say hello, guys.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hello, hello. And of course, this is where I normally introduce our guests, who are also Toby Coulshaw and Nick Brooks. Very weird. So let's keep this resembling something like the usual flow. Nick, introduce yourself more formally as a guest.
Thank you, sir. So for those that don't know me, Nick Brooks, I've been at Microsoft around 7 or so years, pretty much within the talent intelligence function. And prior to that, I worked in executive search and sourcing. So the common thread has always been research throughout my career and my life. Looking forward to sharing more of my story today.
Fabulous, thank you. Mr. Coulshaw, can you do the same?
Yeah, so I lead talent intelligence for Amazon Worldwide Ops and Consumer. So that's everything from ordering online through to warehousing, robotics, through to final mile delivery and drone delivery systems, all that sort of stuff. Been with Amazon for about 3 months or 4 months now, actually. Prior to this, I was over at Philips and ran the talent intelligence team over there. Not a dissimilar background to Nick's. I came from exec search and research and sourcing. Spiraled towards the world of Intel to try and actually get ahead of those decisions and make the sourcing stuff stick, to be honest.
Wonderful. That's great. Thank you both. It's great to have you both on the show. That sounds and feels very weird. As you both know, we've had some great guests so far, so you better live up to those standards. No pressure. Well, actually, loads of pressure. So I think many listeners are familiar with the usual format of the show, but today we're going to switch things up even further, and we're going to do the interview bit first, with Alison bringing out her alter ego of bad cop, or alter egos of bad cops and bad good cops, interview extraordinaire, and interviewing both Toby and Nick. And then we'll do the news bit if we've got time. I may pop up in the interview here and there with some really trivial questions if I can get a word in edgeways once these TI gurus get going. But why don't we crack on? Alison, over to you.
Cool. Thank you, Alan. And this is the one that I am so excited about. I think that we have talked about the Talent Intelligence Collective podcast for such a long time, and we genuinely are joined by two gods of industry here who will hate being described by that, but Nick and Toby. And I'm really hoping that we can get some nuggets of intelligence out of them that will really help all of our listeners. That would be fab. So let's start with a really simple question. What's the difference between talent acquisition and talent intelligence?
Nick, I'll let you take that one.
Oh, I thought you might. Yeah, friendly pass. Okay. I would think of it in terms of execution versus kind of operational efficiency gaining. So think of it, the difference between like sales and sales operations and sales intelligence. You have your sales function executing on sales through engagement with customers, but throughout all of those interactions and throughout all of those engagements, a lot of information is generated, and that kind of information can then be leveled up for competitive advantages and to really gain operational efficiencies in how you go to market. And I feel like talent acquisition and talent intelligence in some ways have that similar synergy. You've got your boots on the ground. You've got individuals who are going out to the market, listening, learning, engaging. And these centralized intelligence functions have the propensity to listen to all of that, provide intelligence, but also reciprocate back and really think about like, how do we operationalize our TA strategies in lieu of what the business needs versus what the market opportunities are saying or the challenges ahead. So that's kind of in a nutshell how I would think about it. But I don't know, Toby, if you have any additional thoughts or comments.
No, I think that's perfect summation.
Oh, Toby, you feel
past. TA is the engine room. It drives things. It gets things moving. Whereas for me, TI is around the decision making before it gets to the engine room. So knowing, like a race car, you got the TA is the engine and there's the performance piece to run through, but TI would be the bit earlier to say what's the track conditions, what do we need to carry in terms of fuel load, what sort of mix are we looking for, that sort of stuff, where you're priming it so that the engine can deliver as effectively in a best way possible for the rest of the org.
So having field past that, you then decided to answer it, which was cool. But I thought, Nick, for me, I loved the way that you described that. I think that when we look at the kind of formulation and the growth and the maturity of talent intelligence, looking at the way that sales and marketing have adapted over the years and used insight to better inform what they're doing, that's just a really neat comparison. I think is taking talent and looking at it through the eyes of sales. We talk about talent intelligence. I've got no idea if this is right, but we talk about talent intelligence being battlefield, kind of the here and now, and what am I doing with my competitors. We talk about it being tactical. How can we better inform our talent acquisition? And then we talk about it being strategic. So what's the stuff that we can really influence on quite a wide scale? Do you think those are terms that we should stick with as a function, or have you got some better ones? Toby, you feel past the last one, so you're going to get that one first.
No, I was going to take it. I don't know. Can we use them? Yeah, absolutely. I think the battle for talent type analogy, I'm not entirely sure is right. I think there was a great article. I think it was Kevin Wheeler wrote it about the fact that the battle for talent it's completely self-created. We've created this battle for ourselves by putting ring fence after hoop after barrier to stop people coming into our companies. We've made it as hard as possible for people to actually get into a company. And even if they do get in, we then make it as hard as possible for them to ramp up and deliver, etc. So I think that whole kind of war for talent thing, I think, ties into the language choice. And I'm not sure that's what we need to be doing. We need to break down that whole barrier piece and make it much more accessible for more people. But I think the language choice to flip back is, I think it's whatever language is going to fit in your organization. So I've been in some orgs that have got very, very heavy militaristic language choice, and the sales teams use it. And because of that, it mirrors in, and it's absolutely appropriate to use that sort of language. And we talk about human and OSINT, etc. That's all coming from a different world. So I think it's the appropriateness of the language for the organization you're in. Some orgs you're going to go into, you use that language, you're going to completely alienate the stakeholders. They're not going to know what you're talking about. It will feel completely wrong for the organization, and it just won't sit. So, yeah, for me, I'm not as concerned about the choice of words. Overall, it's more the appropriateness of the words for your stakeholder or customer.
And you know what, Toby? I think about the choice of words can actually influence behaviors as well. So when you think about the war for talent, it can get organizations very spun up in a reactive kind of mindset. And it can blur kind of strategic thinking and longer term thinking. And it can also inhibit things like screening in and inclusive hiring, right? And I think a lot of that can often come from the pressure of business partners who there's this common notion of hiring can destabilize the competition. And to some extent that can be true, but it can overshadow the bigger picture. What else do we need to be thinking about? What else does the organization need? What is the market saying? Where is there inclusive hiring opportunities and screening in opportunities? So I think, words to an extent really do matter. And it just, I've seen that kind of reactive behavior and mindset spinning up before. And it doesn't always amount to the most productive activities in my experience.
Yeah, very good point.
And I've seen people misuse the phrase as well. So instead of the war for talent, the war on talent, which just sounds cruel and unnecessary. But it's often used.
Beat them down.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks for that little interject, Mr. Walker. It's very cool.
Told you I'd jump in every so often with something trivial.
Yeah, and that's all right, and we love you for exactly that reason. There's been a debate going on at the moment in the collective that's all around what role do you believe sourcing plays in talent intelligence? Any comments? Toby, you've been quite active in that particular debate.
Yeah, like I think it's a hard one in some ways, in the sense of um, I think when you look at a lot of talent intelligence roles out there at the moment, for me, that they're more sourcing roles anyway. They're sourcing or sourcing intelligence. Um, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but I think it when you're saying how does sourcing impact or contribute to TI, I think thinking of it in that term really restricts the potential impact of it. Sourcing overall can have a huge impact on TI. You know, you've essentially got an army of people out there doing primary research day in, day out, talking to hundreds, if not thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of candidates in a very intimate and engaging way. So the ability to get data and to get data points there is amazing. It's insane. There is no other medium that can get that sort of data at that scale in that way. The hard thing, I think, is capturing it, and the hard thing is bringing that back and to make the story out of it. Um, I think it's really hard, particularly because so few organizations have a culture of intelligence, which means it's a byproduct it's very hard to capture. And also their KPIs, their goals of the recruiters aren't gearing them around capturing that sort of information. It's often seen as don't capture into notes because it could be something we get sued for later in the stages, or we're just there to process people through the system. So I think the opportunity, absolutely massive. I think it's one of the harder elements to really nail down and get working effectively, though.
Toby, tagging on to what you were saying there, I think human intelligence and leveraging kind of sourcing in TA is that engine and that kind of exterior facing intelligence collection. The future is systematic, right? I think we want to get to a place where it's the ability to capture those conversations, the richness of data, and be able to aggregate and analyze it really at scale. But I think the place or the phase we're in right now is very high touch, because it's not just about the information being captured, but it's also the interpretation of it, right? And how someone perceives a particular signal from a candidate or a business partner to the next can be very, very different. And you need to obviously account for either things being misheard or even bias as well. So I think when we think about it, we're actually actively reaching out and engaging with folks, with sources, with recruiters, with business partners, and really clarifying on these points. So it's a lot of additional effort, but it's so important that the message or the signal is not misheard or misinterpreted. So I think that's something, as we think about a systematic future, is how do we account for that? How do we account for information integrity? Because I think the systems are there to capture it. Like you say, Toby, the behaviors around it being captured consistently is something that needs to be worked on and pushed. But again, that information integrity, I think, is the biggest challenge behind all of it. But some of that can be accounted for with layering, right? So if you see similar signals consistently being captured across different conversations, you can increase that level of confidence score. So there is the factor of, again, systematically over time, we will be able to get some gains there. But it's an exciting and lucrative future, but it's a big challenge to solve.
So I love the idea of the future being systematic. I think that's really neat. But I want to pick that up and go, how do we achieve that? When, as Toby said, there's a need to have a culture of intelligence. What are the kind of top two things you can do to breed a culture of intelligence within an environment where you're trying to be systematic? Nick, go for it.
Okay. I think what's the first thing that's most important is to make your partners recognize the importance of this information and see the output. So it's kind of that what's in it for me philosophy. When they see the type of information that they're gathering in aggregate that can be brought back to them to apply in conversations, to identify new talent opportunities. So it becomes the motivation for them to want to lean in and listen and learn. So I think there's kind of that part, like how do you motivate folks first? And then the second part for me is, how do you promote best in class behaviors? How do you create a culture of understanding of what good looks like, what best information looks like, how to question everything you hear, how to validate? And again, I think that comes through part of the storytelling and the outputs as well. So being able to take some of the individuals in your organization who really dive deep in conversations with candidates and derive great information. How do they do it? What are the questions they ask? How do they interpret this information? When do they question if something is accurate or not? And you get them kind of storytelling and sharing those perspectives so others can kind of be inspired by that over time. So yeah, I think of those two avenues really, the motivational factor and the output, and then just leveling up capability when it comes to listening, learning, and ingesting.
Thank you. And Toby actually smiled, Nick, when I passed it on to you.
But I would challenge it a little bit though. I think as an industry, we're very good at offering the carrot. I think we spend our lives trying to promote in a positive way why people should do things, why recruiters should use a CRM system, why they should use an ATS effectively, why they should turn down people in the system properly, why they should put interview notes against candidates. Like we spend our lives trying to show the positive spin on things, and I think sometimes you need the stick. You need that kind of the reaction piece of look, this is your job, full stop. And I think that for me, the intel piece is equally nowadays. It's a part of a recruiter's job. We've kind of gone full cycle. If you go back 20 years, intel was absolutely core for a recruiter's role, and we've shifted away from that into this kind of process efficiency type recruiter mentality and model. But for me, it's still a core part of the role. And I think if I was running recruitment teams nowadays, I'd be looking at those roles that are at 30, 60, 90 days, whatever your time to fill point is that everyone has that red flag moment. I'd be looking at the roles that are going out to agency and saying, well, what intel did you provide on intake? How did you set the expectations with the business around what we're doing here? And I think that stick element needs to come in, and we need to challenge people a bit around what are you doing to provide intel to your business and to do this stuff? Because frankly, I think we've been trying to push the carrot element for many, many years, and that culture hasn't been pervasive, but hasn't driven the behaviors because people will naturally go towards their KPIs and their goals. And there aren't any KPIs or goals generally around intel and around actual business consulting. It's around process efficiency, it's time to hire, it's cost per hire, it's etc. So I think for me, I'd probably challenge it a bit.
So then, in an ideal scenario, where do you both see TI gravitating towards?
For me, I think it needs to gravitate towards wherever decisions are being made in the org. So I think there's a few models. I think you can sit within TA, absolutely. I think there's lots of benefits, particularly if we're tying into the sourcing stuff and the recruiter knowledge and that primary intel. Absolutely can sit there. I think we need to be, for me, realistic about who the customer is and can you work outside of TA? Can you impact the business if TA aren't that conduit already? I think equally there could be an absolute case to sit within talent analytics or HR analytics, but equally I think there's absolutely a case also to have a centralized intelligence function and to bring TI and CI and MI and all these other intel functions that are looking at this holistic view together under one house. And then you can start bringing in some other skills that will look across pan functions. So whether it's economists, etc., that are looking at things much broader and saying, how is this all going to change for us as an organization? But yeah, for me, I think whichever way you go, housing the data and the intel centrally in a centralized system has got to happen. We've got to have central knowledge management tools, whether you sit within TA, strategy, ops, finance.
Yeah, okay. So let's move away from kind of function and structure, because I think we're going to come onto that as a section a bit later. But I think I love the idea of this kind of gravitating towards whatever is right for your different organization. But that's not that helpful if you're somebody looking from the outside in at this as new, because actually you're going to be looking at this and going, I don't know what our management is going to want. So can you can you both actually give examples of the obstacles that you have faced, or heard about people facing in getting management to implement some of the findings that have come out of work that teams have done? Nick, perhaps you can take a lead on that one. So what are the obstacles you faced in or you've heard others face in getting management to buy in?
Yeah, so I would say a personal learning for me over the years has been making sure I have a deep enough understanding of the business context, and really just being able to ascertain what the blockers could be before they come. So there could be policy, regulation, compliance, fiscal reasons that decisions happen. If you're not aware of those, you can present the most robust, profound case with data, but it could be dismissed because you've missed some very key steps. So I think this really gets to the heart of, you have to have the right cross-functional partners, relationships, and understanding of the world from their view as much as your own to come together on those conclusions. So I've seen great work that our team has produced over the years, and the decision has come down to something completely out of our control. I'm not necessarily saying anything we could have done would have changed it, but the learning is we address those questions up front before we conduct any work, and we then decide, is it something we can influence, or is it simply beyond our realm of control? Or if so, what part of the decision can we push or influence or start to create some new thinking around? So I think, the business context is absolutely critical. And just over the years of working in a large matrixed organization, I've learned more and more what is fixed and what is kind of up for discussion or debate in some ways. And it's been a fascinating journey.
I love that. So then, Toby, how does that lead into a briefing for a project? Do you have a briefing form with a list of questions on it that you have to kind of go through before determining if a project is going to be right or not?
Yeah, so we both every company I've been in, we've created intake forms, and there's certain criteria that we'd look to meet before we'd actually take work on. And whether that's a financial impact value, whether that's tied to specific strategic pillars, etc., whether it's the leveling in the organisation, what the outcomes and how it's going to impact, etc. I think having some kind of criteria there is really important. It's really important to help make sure that you're working on the right stuff and not just nice to haves. I think the caveat with all of that is, though, you always get curveballs. You're always going to get projects that don't fit any of the criteria you set down. And if it's your SVP or the C-suite that are saying, actually, we need to know about this, just accept that sometimes you're not going to know what the impact value is going to be. I think it's having that criteria, though, it really helps set the groundwork of what do we not want to be working on.
And I love that because it's interesting. I've never worked in house. I've only ever worked for consultancies or for now my own business, and therefore that kind of briefing document is probably the most important thing, because that's the point at which we determine the outputs of a project, and that tells us whether a client is going to come back to us or not, right? Because if we haven't got those outputs right at the beginning, and I think it's, if there was a key kind of top tip for me in businesses that are looking at their TI function for the first time, it would be look at every project through the eyes of an external consultancy. Would you spend money on this externally, and what would the outputs be that would mean that you'd put your hands in your pocket? Let's move on to some success stories. So again, forgive some of the technical delays. I am assured by Alan Walker that he can edit this and polish it. So I'm assuming he can make me look 30 and about 4 stone slimmer by the time we release the video. But no need to comment, Mr. Walker. So let's move on and look a little bit about some of the examples of TI success stories. So we talk a lot, I think, generally, particularly as a collective, about some of the challenges. But if you've got or if you've heard of milestone wins to date, I think those would be really, really interesting to hear from you guys. You're the kind of experts on this.
Yeah, and I think that there's definitely been lots of wins, and I think making the wins business as usual is kind of the ultimate goal, isn't it? If you can just be part of the process, that's what you're really aiming for. And the irony with that is, though, that you forget almost to look at the wins, because they do become business as usual. It's just what's expected. So yeah, absolutely. You know, in terms of the former role at Philips, we had lots of great wins. Whether it's working with location strategy and redesigning location footprint, whether it's working with organisations and functions redesigning their functional footprint or functional structure, whether it's working with the whole business areas and looking at competitors and saying, well, actually, what's their structure? How does it work? Why does it work? How does that reflect upon what we want to do in terms of an org transformation? We had lots of great examples there. I'd almost flip it though and say the bigger learnings are from the failures, and I find that more interesting generally. So we had examples where we presented some really great, robust reports, really suggested don't go into certain locations with certain language skills, for example. The business completely ignored it, put those roles into that location, absolutely couldn't fill them, ended up restructuring and changing everything and moving them all to another location. And to Nick's point earlier, though, it's about realizing that there's a context. And just because somebody doesn't go with your work doesn't mean your work has failed as such. It's just there's a context there. And yeah, I think those failures are far more powerful in my mind, because then you can go back to the business and say, look, this is what we suggested, this is where you went, this is the failure as a result, this is how it's impacted us as an organization to time to fill, cost per hire, the bottom line in terms of profitability, the top line in terms of turnover, whatever it may be. You've then got solid data to back up why they should be focusing on the TI at the front end and listening to your consulting advice. So yeah, the wins are great, but I'd also say, without sounding too depressing to everyone, really focus on those losses as well, because I think that's where you get some of the really good learnings.
And I guess in that context, that's not actually a TI failure anyway. It is a TI win. You gave them the information, they chose to ignore it, and actually the proof was there that the information you provided and the advice you'd given was correct. So you've won on both ankles to a certain degree. But you're right. That has a longer lasting impact in a way, doesn't it? It's like, oh, we should have listened to these guys. They provided this, and it was correct. Whereas if it's right all the time, it's just it's a matter of course to actually go and say, let's see what they've got to say. Just out of interest, kind of thing. Yeah.
I think that's true, but I think that we are, as a group, actually, we're guilty about kind of talking about it because we're in the here and now. If you're an organisation that's in the process now of setting up the business case for this, then actually you can't go, oh my God, look at company ABC. They didn't listen to their talent intelligence team and they wasted £400 million by going in the wrong direction. You've got to be able to talk about success stories in order to build out your business case. So, as a function, once you're set up as a function, then sure, some of the misses help you to build out your kind of reach and your strategic objective. But that doesn't help in the first instance with, oh my goodness, we're just setting up. What are the success stories? Nick, can you touch on some success stories, perhaps, that people who are building business cases could use?
Yeah, absolutely. So I look back over the years, and some of the successes we've had have been around location strategy. One, where we've actually influenced first mover advantage in some locations, which we've then gone on to hire above representation of skills, above the targets that were set, and actually seeing considerable investment. So I just want to emphasize, though, we're an indirect influencer, right? So we're one part of that decision chain. So there's many other cross-functional partners who are very involved, but just being able to have a seat at the table and actually influence some of these new opportunities has been significant. I think in a similar vein, headcount planning and distribution, very often the business has one perspective. We need to hire these individuals to meet a business objective, but without the understanding of the landscape and the potential of talent across different regions, they don't always think about where it should go. So we've influenced some pretty significant distribution of talent on a global scale, which again has then amounted to hiring over and exceeding the targets that were set initially. And this has then contributed to some of the most successful, fastest growing businesses in the company. So you kind of look back and reflect and say, it might have seemed menial at the time, but these individuals have become kind of the growth engine of particular businesses that the company is now really seeing great success around. And then there's kind of a third avenue for me personally, which is being able to answer and address questions in the flow of work to senior leaders and executives across the company. And they're the wildcard options. They can come in any shape or form about any organization, any region, any market. And again, you don't always know how profoundly that impacted an overall decision, but you know it played a part because they keep coming back and asking additional questions, right? And that engagement, to me, is in some ways a measure of success, that they trust you, that you're credible. And if you think about executives and senior leaders have a view across the company, they're looking at the customer footprint, they're looking at the sales workforce, they're looking at the market, they understand the business nuances. There are many factors they have to take into account to make decisions as to where we go as a company. So for them to keep coming back to you and kind of trusting your opinion on certain avenues, I think is a real measure of success. So I personally get a lot of reward out of that, just the engagement with senior leaders who just continuously throw us very unique, often vague and ambiguous questions, but they're fun because you can get creative and you can bring context back that they may not have even asked for. But I think, to Toby's point, the recognition of failure is equally as important as the successes, right? And it's that learning perspective. How do you mitigate that again? And sometimes as well, that can really help in the early stages of setting up a function. You give an option, but you also give the other option. What's the cost of doing nothing? What's the reverse to that, right? So you either act based on the information we give you, or you don't. What could the implications be? And that's how you can start to drive some consumption and I guess, actions off the work that you put forward.
I'm going to pick up on this starting a function piece in a minute, but I wanted to touch on something that you talked about then, which I loved, which was the fastest growing businesses within our portfolio. And I think we talk a lot about working with enterprise clients and global businesses. And actually, what you're talking about is influencing actually on a smaller scale, but in high growth businesses. And I think it's important that we help our listeners to understand that you don't have to be an Amazon or a Philips or a Microsoft or or an Intel or any of the fantastic guests that we've got on. That actually you can be a small high growth business, and it is as critical to understand talent intelligence as it is in the big players. Toby, what advice would you give to a fast growth smaller business?
Yeah, no, it's more critical. Absolutely, it's more critical. The smaller you are, the more critical it is. I was actually just talking to somebody about this yesterday, because they've just joined a relatively small company, and they were saying, I don't know whether we can get the investment for a TI function, something we'd have to build out, etc., etc. The smaller you are, the more important talent intelligence is. If a company of 60, 70, 80,000, 100,000, a million people put 60, 70, 80 software engineers in the wrong place with the wrong structure, the wrong branding, whatever it may be, it will be painful, but they're going to survive. If you're a company of 200 and you do that with 50 people, you're going under. There's no way to survive that. So for me, the smaller you are, the more important it is to get good data in as early in everything that you're doing. In the same way that you see a lot of very small startups make the mistake of waiting too long before getting ahead of HR or ahead of TA, etc. I think the same is true of TI. I think you've got to, the earlier you bring that in, the earlier you instill that as a cultural thing, the better. And the size is irrelevant. The smaller you are, the more important it's going to be to try and get that as a strategic importance of your function.
And I really like
Yeah,
that.
just
because
to add some. Oh, I'm sorry, Alison. Sorry, Alison, go ahead.
No, Nick, don't apologise to me. You go ahead. You're a guest today. You don't have to apologise today of all
I
days.
feel so privileged. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to take full advantage. I know it's haven't got much of a window left. Yeah, Toby, I completely agree. I think the other thing about smaller, growing organisations is that you can have more of an influence up to the senior levels of leadership. There aren't legacy processes. There aren't mature organizations. So you can kind of be building that as you go through a lens of like the work that you do. So you can intentionally create a function that has the right customers, the right stakeholders, and the right partners from the word go, without having to kind of develop those relationships and build credibility across a large organization. So it's even more profound. I think you're right. And that risk factor is so important to recognize, that the risk of getting it wrong in a smaller organization is much greater than a large enterprise that has some sense of coverage or obviously a multi-strategy kind of portfolio. So pros and cons, but I think for any of our listeners, that be excited about the potential you have in some of the smaller organizations to have a greater influence in some ways.
Yeah, and I think what's really neat about that, and I've got to get the phrase in because I get it in every time. We talk about joining the dots. You talked earlier about cross-functional stakeholders. Actually, in a smaller organisation, you can bring in your head of real estate, your head of risk, your head of strategy. You can bring in your head of TA and your HR director and talent intelligence, and all into one place, and kind of genuinely, I think, influence strategy. Yeah, and I think that's really neat. I want to ask another question over the use of talent intelligence, because again, I think we all live in this world, right? So we spit out, oh, you use it for location planning, and we expect people to understand what on earth that means. So I think, Toby, could you take one use of talent intelligence and just kind of talk? It doesn't have to be through the lens of company. Just talk about what that actually means. What do you do, and what are the outputs? And then Nick, perhaps you could choose something other than another use and do the same. I think that would be fascinating for people to hear. So Toby, over to you to start.
Yeah, I'd say the core thing, as we mentioned earlier, is understanding what the problem is. So you mentioned, location. Fine, let's go with location. Start by just using what you have. Like most people listening to this will either be in a talent acquisition function, an HR function, a TI function. They're going to have tools at their disposal. So it's going to have an internal ATS or a CRM. If you don't have them at all, you might have a LinkedIn LinkedIn Recruiter license. If you don't have LTI, you might have LinkedIn Recruiter. If you've got LinkedIn Recruiter, you've also got premium insights on LinkedIn company pages, for example. So there's a huge amount of information at your fingertips within the products you're comfortable with before you even start digging into TI specific products, or before you even start digging into things like national labour statistics bodies, ONS data, like before you even start looking at that stuff, you've got a lot of data to play with and a lot of data to give you stability and that initial kickoff, as it were. How to actually do this stuff: meet with the business, understand what the business problem is. Whether it's the time to hire, you need to get people in quick because you're trying to stand up for a certain project, whether it's the fact that you've got a high attrition rate, whether it's the fact that you're rapid growth period and you know that this 10 people aren't going to be an issue, but the next 200 are going to be the issue. Like, understand what the real context is and the business problem is, because that's going to dramatically impact what we're using location on this one, what the location strategy is going to be, whether you're going to look at something that's fully remote, whether you're going to look at something that's a hybrid, whether you're going to look at main cities. We've seen a lot of research recently post-COVID around hollowing out cities and things pushing into a commuter belt. Okay, well, how do you take advantage of that? So I think first thing first, find out what it is you're trying to answer. What's that business problem? What are you trying to achieve? And what the good outcome's going to look like, to Nick's point earlier. Then start just using the data you're comfortable with. If you're a recruiter, absolutely those anecdotal conversation feedback is valid, but then get hard data points to see how that sits. Does it corroborate or does it not? If it doesn't, why are they going? Why is it wrong? Why is it different? Just start being that investigative person and start challenging the data.
So we talk then about data as if it's at everyone's fingertips, and that's because we live in a world where it is, right? Because we've either designed tools or you've got tools. What do you mean by data? Are you looking at how many people are there? What's the cost of real estate? If you had to kind of spell it out, what would be the key data points?
Yeah. So for example, if you've got LinkedIn Recruiter, you're going to have from that also LinkedIn Company Insights on LinkedIn.com. So you're going to have a count of your whatever company you're looking at, the current job opportunities and openings. You're going to have an idea of total employee count. You're going to have an idea of median tenure. You're going to have not new hires, the company alumni. You're going to have where people live, where they studied. You're going to see from LinkedIn Recruiter, what the past companies were, the years of experience, the languages spoken, etc., etc. There's a lot of very granular data that if you're using it as a recruiter, you might see it as, well, that's my search parameter. It's exactly the same from a TI perspective of saying, well, that's no longer a pure search parameter, that's a data point. If it's telling me, great example, I had a recruiter contact me saying, I've got these search criteria. and it was for manufacturing, Lean Six Sigma manufacturing stuff. And they said, well, we can't find it within the industry. I've done all these searches on all the platforms, can't find any candidates. We need some TI from the gods to give us a new candidate population to answer this. The answer was staring them in the face the whole time. That candidate population didn't exist in the industry they wanted. They got thousands, tens of thousands of candidates when you looked at automotive and when you looked at the other industries that they weren't looking at. It literally didn't exist in the industry they were focusing on. But because they were so tight to the parameters and they were looking at just pure LinkedIn results, they weren't seeing what the data was telling them. And I think that for me is a great example of where the data is always there. Everything is a data point. It's just seeing the context of what you're seeing.
It's really interesting. We've just finished a project for a big telcos business over some really specific engineering talent, and they insisted on 4 different subskills. They had a particular job title for this particular role that they'd struggled to find in the past, and they insisted on industry knowledge. And so the first thing we did was we went back and we went, right, your total talent pool is 640 people, and you hire 102 of them. So, let's start by going, that's not going to work, is it? Okay. But actually, if you took 3 of the skills, this is what happens to your talent pool. And by the way, this is what all of these people call themselves in the market. So you need to stop calling this role that, because, people aren't going to apply for it if you call it that. And by the way, if you remove the industry lens and think about reskilling, then you open up your talent pool to more than 22,000. And they just never looked at it. It was kind of this dispelling of an old myth. And I guess that's a great example of taking some data points and breaking it down and going, actually, this is right in front of you. You needed us to tell you some of the bigger picture stuff, but a bunch of this is in front of you. Nick, can you give us examples that are quite granular like that, where you're talking about, it doesn't have to be a location strategy, it could be something else that you've informed, and the data points that your team would pull together?
Yeah, so I was just thinking through that. One of the earliest question you asked us today was, what's the difference between talent acquisition and talent intelligence, or how are they connected? So I'll give you an example that's kind of in the natural flow. So from Toby talked about location strategy. Let's assume that a location has been decided. You're then at the point of delivering a sourcing and recruiting strategy, right? Which I think of in some ways as like a go-to-market strategy in a sales organization. That is about, why you're going to invest in a location, and it's about the how. It's about how you execute, right? So the natural flow is that through that location study, you've already understood why you're going to go there because of talent availability. It could be diversity, it could be cost of talent, it could be competition or lack of competition thereof. All of that information needs to be taken into account as to how do we then go and engage that talent pool. So you want to look at things like brand resonance. So Toby mentioned LinkedIn. Talent Insights is a tool that's very close to our hearts here, of course. But you can look at things like brand recognition, in-mail response rates. Do you have any footprint within that region already or not? You're going to have to work harder. Do you have to deliver a social or a marketing campaign? There are things like employee value propositions, which vary region to region. What matters to folks? Is it compensation forward? Is it about purpose? Is it about culture? Is it about leadership? So it's knowing kind of what particular market you're going to, what is going to resonate most with that talent. It's about things like compensation. Are you aligned effectively to that market? Are you going to go in with a competitive stance, or are you creating an inequity? For example, if you're a first mover, are you being respectful of that ecosystem and doing what is economically right? There's also factors around the competition. So really understanding who's there, why is it going to be challenging, how do we recruit against, how do we recruit from, what's the story? So really just understanding like what is our connection to that competitor and what kind of challenges that will create ahead. So it's kind of taking a lot of the work that's being done around the location strategy and building it into like your execution strategy for recruiters, for sources, so that you can increase your chances of success. Because ultimately, you want to hire in a timely manner with mitigating as many high costs as possible and really landing on those business objectives, because obviously time is a factor that can impact success. So it's kind of a natural transition, but this kind of work can still very much sit within talent intelligence, and it becomes almost a natural handoff to your TA partners as they start to execute and engage the market, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And what's neat about that is actually it ties into that kind of tactical versus strategic that we were talking about at the beginning. Is you've both given some quite tactical examples, but also some really big strategic examples. Where do we put people? Where do we put software engineers in order for us to maximise our chances of hiring? I want to move on to kind of the last section. And Alan, I think we're going to scrap news because these guys are just awesome.
Yeah,
if
scrap
that's all right.
news.
Yeah, scrap news. Sorry, nothing exciting
My
going
one
on.
thing.
Ah.
One thing. Get rid of it.
Toby, you did some brilliant research on news, which we love, which obviously we can share outside of here. So thank you for doing your research, but we're going to ignore it. So I want to kind of look at the last section, and the last section for me is about talent intelligence as a function, and therefore talent intelligence as a career. So Nick, you talked earlier about if you were starting a function from scratch. Let's go with that. What pearls of wisdom can you give on the operational structure side of talent intelligence?
Yeah, so I might answer in a slightly different way and think about the skills that can make up a successful function, and I guess the confluence of skill sets. And it's really interesting. I know, Toby, you ran a poll recently, and there was kind of mixed results around, like, is this an end destination? Is it a drop-off point into another career? I think this function is only just getting started. We've talked about cross-functional synergies, partnerships with groups like corporate strategy, marketing, sales intelligence. But within the TI function, I think there's a few kind of skill sets that are absolutely critical. You've got one, which is kind of the client engagement and the consulting component, right? The ability to engage with business partners, to listen intently, to ask great questions, to really deep dive and triage on the problem at hand and know enough that you can develop a great solution. And then you've got obviously your kind of research type skills, which are your deep analysts, maybe even bleeding into data scientist type skills as well. So I think within TI, you can start to see you've got very much like customer facing and then kind of the back end data analysis and aggregation skills. And then you see a confluence of both of those. Now, I kind of put myself in that bracket. I'm by no means a data science expert, but I have reasonable data acumen. But I'm also quite heavy on the client side and the storytelling and the engagement. So I get to kind of play both roles. But I think functionally there are other roles as well. I mean, you've got the more programmatic piece for managing operations, managing those relationships over time. But yeah, I know, Toby, we've talked about it a few times as well. I mean, what else do you think in terms of kind of developing these skills and this function from the ground up?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I think it's so. The reason I love this industry at the moment is people are coming at it from so many different angles. So you're seeing teams that are spun up from librarians. You're seeing teams that are spun up from sourcing. You're seeing teams that are spun up from corporate intelligence, marketing intelligence, competitive intelligence. There's a huge variance of where the angles people are coming at things from. I think to your point, the skills are really important. Having that blend of skills. And that's where you're seeing HR analytics tend towards more the consulting thing. They've got the good technical skills, but they're wanting more consulting. And I think most TI teams are good at the business partnering and the data wrangling, but they're not necessarily hardcore data scientists. And we're probably beefing out more on that data side of things. I think the core thing for me when you're starting out from scratch, though, have flexibility. You don't know what's going to come through your door. And depending on your organisation, that can vary wildly from org design to strategy to M&A to TA. Like, you just don't know what that big red flag, that fire is going to be. So I'd say if you're starting out from scratch, try and have a team that's got some flexibility. Move people around. Don't have people siloed in, I only ever do location studies, I only ever do diversity studies, I only ever do whatever, because suddenly you've got single points of failure. Any of them go, you've got no coverage for any of that skill set again. So I'd say get some flexibility, move people around. But I think to Nick's point, we're at the beginning. I think we've got a long way to see where this is all going to develop to.
And to add to that, Toby, one thing I'd say is kind of leveling up the contribution, right? So I think talent intelligence is, let's call it like the data layer, is not necessarily new. It's growing, it's becoming more ubiquitous, but we've been using this data in some shape or form for many years. I think the opportunity ahead is how we take that data and take it levels up in an organization to influence beyond just the execution of hiring. to influence business and corporate and commercial strategy and move markets and change the culture of organizations. So I think I want to see people talk more aspirationally about what else can I do with TI? How can I change my organization? I know I am the subject matter expert of the external landscape. Now, how can I help other business partners and leaders in my company unlock that for different means that we haven't tapped into today? And that's kind of where I see the horizon. And it starts to actually blend again more towards commercial and marketing intelligence, towards commercial and corporate strategy businesses. And that gets me pretty fired up. I think that's an exciting proposition because a lot of these businesses want that data and that knowledge and that understanding. We have the context and the understanding of how to unlock it, right? So there's just a really profound opportunity ahead.
And I think that's really exciting because that impacts on the careers of people and the opportunities for people. And I'm going to come to our last question now because Alan Walker's just given me his little cough. But I think if I tie into that kind of mentality, Nick, we talk a lot to businesses who are just in the early stages of setting up a talent intelligence function. And the first thing that we say to them is think big, think strategic, because actually it's quite hard to navigate your way towards that. If you start there, you can start to filter down into some of the detailed projects. But if you don't think big in the first place, then actually I think it's quite tricky. So I'm going to ask both of you one top tip for. In fact, no, I'm not. I'm going to change my mind. So, Nick, you can do one top tip for a global enterprise setting up a new function, and Toby, you could do one top tip for a fast growth kind of 2,000 to 10,000 employee type business. So then we're covering both ends. So, Nick, one top tip for a global enterprise setting up for a TI function for the first time.
I would say have a very clear understanding of who your customers and your partners are and build those relationships as early and as soon as possible. Because that learning journey, let's assume that you've got the right skills within your team, you've invested in the right people. Knowing who the right partners are to unlock new opportunities and learn from, and additional data sources and context and that kind of like business understanding is critical. And then ruthlessly prioritizing who your customers are. Who are those that you should be delivering to, no questions asked? And be really, really focused on that because the reason you're delivering to those customers is because impact happens, actions happen, change happens, right? So I think it's just before you get into doing the work itself, understand where the work is going to go and then how the work is going to get done before you actually put any pen to paper in some respects.
Really neat. Toby, I've got 1 minute left. So, one top tip.
Resource way heavier than you think you're going to need. Full stop. I think that's the biggest mistake I made, and the biggest mistake I've made in teams in the past. I've been too conservative. And even though we grew the team out at Philips to be a fairly considerable team, I look at it and think it still could have been 2, 3, 5 times the size if I'd have been more aggressive and pushed harder. I think I was very conservative in terms of I didn't want to have this huge team that had a massive magnifying glass over it because we weren't delivering at impact, we weren't delivering at scale. The reality is the work is there. Decisions are being made without you. If not, if you're lucky, they're having advice from a big consulting firm or something. But reality is there's some massive business decisions happening with very, very little labour market feasibility going on. So I would say scale up far harder, far faster than you think you're going to need.
I love that. Thank you. And do you know what I've really enjoyed about today, apart from the fact that the video and talking piece has been slightly random, but the piece that has really worked for me today is I think every time we run one of these podcasts with a guest, we end up with a pearl of wisdom. What I think we've got today is pearls of wisdom, but also what I hope the listeners have really got out today is some really solid practical advice. How do I do it? What do I do? What works? So thank you, Toby and Nick. I know you were both a bit weird and nervous about doing this. I hope I've only played good cop. And thank you from the bottom of my heart for being so pleasant.
No, thank you.
Thanks, Alison.
A lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. So, as we said, no news today, but, no news is good news. So, anyway, I know I say this every episode. I also say that every episode, but time is drawing in. We can't chat forever. We need to stop eventually. So, unfortunately, it's time to bring this brilliant, unique episode to a close. I want to thank each of you. Alison, thanks for being the question master. Toby and Nick for kind of semi-co-hosting, although you didn't really have to do any hosting this time. But an enormous thank you to you both for being our guests. You've been great. How did you find it as an experience?
Terrifying.
Big sigh of relief. We survived it. Yeah.
Fair enough.
guys
And to our
very
listeners,
generous. Thank you.
and to our listeners and, of course, viewers, hopefully this time, a huge thanks for tuning in. Stay intelligent, folks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.